vote by proxy.
9 members total.
But he cannot constitute one of the 9 to make a quorum. Yeah. So I have to have at least one Democrat.
I see. I heard a statement that you made the other day that I'll talk to you about it. Clever.
Luca.
We used the picture where you were holding up the subpoena. It's on the
Oh,
jump page.
really?
It's on the jump page. I believe it was 727. I think it is. Isn't it 27 right there? Or is it
What?
Page 27.
No, I don't have 27.
You don't have it, see? Yes, there we are. Look at the bottom.
Oh, there it is. I see. Yeah, there we are. Oh, yeah.
That was last
There
night.
aren't many days that go by that I don't have 27. I just haven't had a chance to even look at them. George's pictures, I always look at first.
That's all I really look at. Sometimes I get to reading. One of these days I say I'm going to retire, and one ambition is to read the Times. It really takes everything I've got sometimes to read that.
Well, you're going to have it delivered down to Nags Head.
That's where I'm
North Carolina. You're going to have the Times delivered at Nags Head, North Carolina.
That's where I'm going to. That's where I have a house here. I'm going to be a constituent of the senator here.
Gee.
You know? So,
Yeah, you better be nice to him.
Yeah,
or he better be nice to you.
Well, because my oldest daughter is the chairperson of the League of Women Voters for that little area. Of course, they only have 27 members, but that whole town doesn't have very many people.
Well,
Manio.
the Runner chapter of the league has 6 and some odd.
Yeah, so they do.
They make more noise per capita than anybody I ever saw.
That they do. That they do. But I thought that my daughter, when she took over last year, she did pretty good because whenever they'd have somebody come in, they would send them. She'd get together with her committee and send the person a list of about 20 to 25 questions, and then say, these are the questions that we're going to ask, and would you like to submit a written report for which they included in their report?
Just go Washington Post.
See on the way. I'd ask if any of the members of the Senate present until our witness arrives have any statements that they would like to make. Yeah, the question is, while we're waiting for General Haig, are there any statements that any members who are present would like to make at this time?
Well, I should say a few good words about North Carolina, but I don't think that would be relevant.
Senator Helms has volunteered to answer any questions that anyone would like to put to him about North Carolina.
Did we go on again? No. No cases even on that? No. I tried. Bush rally, North Carolina. I will not comment on that.
General Haig, in accordance with an understanding I have with Senator Pell, if the minority has not returned by the appointed end of the recess, then we would continue with the next questioning from a member of the majority, Senator Lugar.
Mr. Chairman, General Haig, this morning, during the questioning by both Senator Helms and Senator Biden, considerable mention was made of the Republican Party platform, and this, of course, brought to mind not only the formulation of that platform, the workings of our political parties and convention, but the very spirited election campaign that came after that. And you pointed out that essentially the American people drew some conclusions on the basis of the presentation of the candidates for president and for the Congress, and likewise the expressions of the parties in their platforms. And as I recall, after a very serious questioning by Senator Helms, you came to an agreement with Senator Helms that principles remain constant, that circumstances change, that you as Secretary of State would not want to be bound today or tomorrow by particular circumstances, nor would Senator Helms. But at the same time, there are some themes in that platform, and these were illuminated by Senator Helms and likewise by my colleague, Senator Hayakawa. Now, I make this point in the form of at least a short statement in the use of my time as opposed to a question to you, because it seems to me that it's important in this hearing, and as we come to an understanding of what this hearing is about, that the American people spoke on November the 4th with regard to a whole gamut of issues. And elections are never determined, nor would any of us conclude that they are determined on a specific issue of foreign policy or domestic policy. But the Republican platform was markedly different than the Democratic platform. Markedly different. And so were many of the contests for the Senate and indeed the one for the presidency. And the decision of the people was conclusive. The majority of the people of the United States have voted for Ronald Reagan for president. He has asked you to be his nominee for Secretary of State. He has done so, we are told, on his own testimony and by a great deal of testimony by his advisors and even more by press analysis, because you share his point of view. And his point of view is that is shared essentially by the Republican platform in terms of principle. Now, the points of view of Governor Reagan and now President-elect Reagan are markedly different from the opposition party in other respects. And indeed, it appears to me that the American people said two general things, and that is that they wanted changes in the ways in which we were perceived by ourselves, by our allies, and by our potential adversaries. And they wanted a change in our domestic policy with regard to an end to inflation and the high interest rate situation. Indeed, they wanted growth of our economy again. They rejected a no growth or greening of America theme, which is certainly an arguable area, but they came down on that side. I think it's instructive, at least at this stage in the confirmation proceedings, that some of the most exciting testimony, at least, and I have not attended the other two hearings that I shall mention. I've been busy in this one, but obviously your hearing is attracting a great deal of attention. I'm advised that the ideas that are being presented by Mr. Stockman with regard to the budget and potential cuts and reordering of priorities and the sacrifices we shall have to pay, that his views are taken by some as shocking and unconventional, even though he is acknowledged as very well prepared, even by his adversaries in those situations. And I understand that Mr. Watt is attracting some attention in his thoughts on the environment, on economic growth. Now, it appears to me that in a very unusual way, the focus of attention in this interim period has come down to your hearing, to Mr. Watts and to Mr. Stockman's. and essentially for good reason. There are changes that are in the air. There are changes that are represented. The opposition party, as a matter of fact, would prefer that the nominees had been persons who shared more their point of view. I think that is understandable. They would feel more comfortable with someone who was much more like a Secretary of State in the past administration, maybe much less like you. Clearly, they are staggered by Mr. Stockman and I suppose likewise by Mr. Watt. But I think we are all in these hearings as a public coming to an appreciation that this is what an election means. People make points of view known and in the aggregate, and President-elect Reagan is following through on that. Not cutting his sails right off the bat. He's suggesting really the people meant it. They want a perception of a stronger America. Now, the dilemma that I lay before you, and it's one that I share, I think it's one that this committee shares, is that I have a fairly firm conviction that Mr. Stockman and Mr. Watt, even though there may be extended hearings, maybe discussion on the floor of the Senate, will be confirmed. And they will proceed. There will have been an honest locking of horns, and people will have been very competitive in their ideas. There may even be parliamentary situations, but ultimately the majority rules, and there is a majority of Republicans in the Senate. And a majority of people in the country, I think, stand behind at least the opportunity of Ronald Reagan to express himself and his party's viewpoint through these people. I have no doubt that given the goodwill of the minority on this committee, that you will be confirmed. There is, I think, unanimity of viewpoint that we need a Secretary of State, and that we need one promptly, and that this country faces grave danger. If there is any misperception on the unanimity of our Senate confirmation proceedings, at least to have a Secretary of State, even if there is not unanimity on yourself as the person. But what I think we are looking at, and I do not predict the testimony this afternoon of the archivist when he comes. His testimony, however, has been telegraphed ahead in a way. In essence, my understanding is he will indicate that he has some problems, which he expressed to the chairman, Senator Percy, yesterday, as far as voluntarily giving a log that we requested as a committee unanimously. And that request was in good faith on the part of Republicans and Democrats alike. As Senator Baker, I think, articulated the other day, as opposed to a fishing expedition, we really ought to zero in on those elements of evidence that might be most useful and direct our attention to prompt expedition of that situation. Now, maybe the archivist will surprise me and say essentially, now that I've received the subpoena, in fact, here is the log, and have a go at it and begin to examine what you want to do. My understanding is he is unlikely to do that, and as a matter of fact may very well indicate some legal problems and some problems of precedent. And therefore, we're going to be in a dilemma which I lay out in this portion of the hearing, because I'm hopeful that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will try to share this burden too. There will be, I think, a temptation to prolong the confirmation of Alexander Haig forever, if necessary, in terms of leaving open not only the record but the possibility for review. What we're going to look, I hope, all of us very carefully at the legal position and the possibilities for success. But as was a part of our argument the other day, both publicly and privately, it is not at all clear that the tapes that we seek are going to be available in the next few weeks or the next few months. As a matter of fact, there are some legal scholars, I am told, who predict that this situation might linger on for a matter of years. This means that unlike Mr. Stockman and Mr. Watts, who I believe are going to be confirmed ultimately, even after great controversy, you may be confirmed and still have an open hearing, an exploration of a situation over which you have no control, but which I think is not only your problem, but our problem as a country, and this is why I raise it. I think very serious thought is going to have to be given as to how your effectiveness is impaired by having an ongoing trial and what amounts to not a replay of Watergate, but a non-playing of it, or the possibility of a playing of it 5 months, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years down the trail, maybe at a time of very sensitive negotiations in which you are involved on behalf of all of us, and suddenly, out of the blue, a court somewhere says, by golly, here are the tapes. And this committee then comes back and has another try at it. Now, that is not a pleasant prospect for this country, quite apart from yourself and your effectiveness. And I think this is something we're going to have to weigh very carefully at a committee. It's something I'm weighing very carefully as I articulate out loud a consideration that I think is very grave about this hearing as it stands. And it just seems to me that as a group of people, of rational people, we're going to have, in some comedy of goodwill, as to how we discharge our duty of trying to find those things that are relevant and at the same time not impair a Secretary of State. Now, I am mindful as I say this, and I think the chairman would concur that the action that we took on Saturday was generally applauded throughout the country. There is no stomach in the country for cover-up in this committee, for the arbitrary use of majority power, for simply a whitewash situation, and I don't appeal for that either. As a matter of fact, as eager as I am to expedite these hearings, and as far as I'm concerned, a vote could be held at 4 o'clock this afternoon, not 4 o'clock Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, Monday, whenever we get to it. I think the issues are well known, and I respect the rights and privileges of my colleagues, and they will exercise those to go into exhaustive detail into other parts of history as they sort of play out the time. But the central issue, I think, is one that I'm trying to form presently in a groping way as to how we have an honest controversy and at the same time come to a conclusion with confidence in you and with the country having confidence in you and without a sort of Damocles hanging over the situation, what I think would be historically a very unfortunate situation. I apologize for taking your time that you might have given in response to questions to make this comment, but at least it is a reservation that we have on the committee that you can use the time in a way that you believe will lead to productive thought, and so I've chosen to do it in this way. I would simply add that I appreciate the points of view you have expressed, the remarkable way you have attempted to reassure those who oppose you, while not undermining those who strongly support you. I am one of the group that strongly supports you, that hopes to see your confirmation quickly, without strings attached, and without things hanging over the future that will jeopardize not only your effectiveness, but likewise our ability as a power that needs greater respect to have an unfinished piece of business that lingers. Thank you very much.
Senator Lugar, on my time, I would like to thank you for those comments. Senator Baker said he supported the action taken by the committee because there is precedent for it. But at that time, when it was in the case of Dr. Henry Kissinger, it was the intention of this committee to investigate several matters that the committee members felt had to be investigated, but do so in such a way as to never undercut or impair his authority, to never interfere with the carrying out of the national foreign policy, and to bear uppermost in mind the national interest. I can assure you on behalf of every member of this committee, those same principles will adhere in this case. And in the case of Dr. Kissinger, the committee issued a report promptly stating that it had looked into those matters at the direction of the committee, that there was nothing in the investigation revealed that would have changed in one iota his decision to confirm his nomination. And we will conduct it and carry it out, and I believe I speak on the behalf of all committees. We would walk in your shoes and recognize that we want no cloud hung over your head, and I thank again the minority for their willingness to go right ahead with the confirmation proceedings. But we will expeditiously as possible handle this other matter. And I thank you, Senator Lugar, for your comments. Any comments you'd care to make, General Haig, we'd be happy to have.
I would have no comments on these issues at all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Then in accordance, in accordance with our understanding, if the Democrats had not completed their caucus, the majority would proceed. We will now resume our regular order. The chair will recognize first Senator Glenn and then Senator Sarbanes.
I don't think in listening to this the last few minutes, I don't think anybody on either side of the aisle disagrees with much that was said here. I certainly don't. And I somewhat resent our side being placed in the position here of having to respond as though we're in the dock here for having done something wrong. I don't think that's the case at all. There are legitimate questions. And I would probably almost, we could vote now and continue this stuff later. I'll probably vote for you, General Haig. And that's not a firm commitment at this point, but there are a lot of very serious questions here. And we're trying to get to it. And we've been thwarted in not being able to get what material there is in trying to bring these things out. And we're talking about very serious stuff. We had procedures in the White House at that time for how these very sensitive matters of who would be assassinated, what governments were going to be toppled, and there were procedures set up. And we don't have a firm substantiation of exactly how some of those things were decided and carried out. General Haig was right in the middle of all that over there. I don't know whether he acted under orders. I don't know whether somebody turned to him sometime and said, Al, you handle that. And he went and handled it. And on his own decision, bypassing the Committee of 40 and other folks, he made decisions that may have meant people's lives or nations rising or falling.
Senator Glenn.
So it disturbs me when we think that we're being cast over here as the group trying to get some information to which is irrelevant. We're trying to delay this. It's going to be an orgy of Watergate. Horse feathers. That's not what we're trying to do. This is no orgy of Watergate. We're talking about a man that's going to be the foreign policy of the United States. And I want him to go into that job as clear as he can go into it. I want to be able to back him with every fiber in my body in what he's doing, because we need somebody in there. And it's not necessarily of his making that we need a man that has opinions on these matters. During the campaign, the campaign statements were anything but clear on foreign policy. We're going to blockade Cuba. Well, what a poppycock bit of nonsense that is. And I haven't asked you that one yet, General Haig, but I'll telegraph that one in advance. But we're going to do all sorts of weird things here. And the President-elect has said that this is the man that's going to set and determine much of foreign policy and deal with these nations around the world. And I want him to go into that job as clear as he can possibly be, with no taint of all this past stuff about Watergate. I want to get it behind us, as much as anybody on this committee, that side of the aisle and this. Because we've got nations hanging on his every word here. You can bet that there isn't an embassy in Washington isn't tuned into PBS right now, and I bet the cable traffic's gone up 50% in the last 3 days. And I want him to go into this able to set foreign policy, and that's the reason we want to determine what some of these big matters are. So I blew 5 minutes of my time here, but anyway.
Senator Glenn, you are not hanging out alone on this, and this is why it was the desire of the chair not move on the original motion, but move on a motion where we could stand together unanimously. And we
I had
did,
hoped that we would
but
have unanimous objectivity here, that we would ask for those tapes, we'd all fight as a committee to get them as a congressional right so we could get this stuff behind us once and for all. We're into all sorts of little niceties here, and I think we're going to be all stymied because Nixon isn't about to give up his right to keep those tapes from getting out anyway. Be a 6-month deal getting them out through the courts or whatever, and so I think the likelihood of getting them out is pretty remote. But let me get on to another subject.
1 second.
1 second.
You said, there he sits, he is going to be the foreign policy of the United States.
I
Now,
believe
we
that.
spent some time on Saturday trying to lay out that although the President and the Secretary of State may be the spokesman for foreign policy, that the foreign policy of the United States is the product of the coordinate decisions of the legislative and executive branches. And General Haig agreed to that. And lest that subject get muddied, I thought we ought to reaffirm that understanding.
Okay, very good. New subject, General. Well, I
we
thought
will
it was-
yield to you an extra 2 minutes.
All right, thank you very much. General, does the idea of Gaddafi having a nuclear arsenal disturb you?
Greatly.
Well, it disturbs me greatly, too. And some of your answers to the, in response to Senator Dodd, who introduced the NNPA legislation, as Senator Percy and I did here on this side, he introduced it in the House at that time. Some of your answers there bothered me a little bit, and I wanted to follow up on them. You have indicated in a, well, you indicated first that policies toward India must be our policies toward Pakistan. So that was in the testimony the other day, I believe. Or they should be very similar. Now, if we go back, Gaddafi has been the one who has been furnishing dollars as well as yellow cake shipments to Pakistan, hoping to get an Islamic bomb, as they've called it. Yet, in your recent article in the Chief Executive magazine, you stated, the present administration has made matters worse by using blackmail against Germany and France, its own allies, by using threats to cut off uranium shipments if they proceeded to build nuclear facilities in Brazil and Pakistan. Now, the Republican platform came out against the shipment of nuclear fuel to India because of past abuses. I fought that one on the Senate floor here. I lost 48-46. I'm still sorry we lost. I think it was a mistake of this administration. I think the Senate was wrong, although I got voted down fairly and squarely, but it was a 48-46 vote. Now, let me point out that it was the Ford administration with Kissinger as Secretary of State began exerting pressure on France to break its contracts, firm contracts, to supply Pakistan with nuclear equipment and technology, and that they knew Pakistan was trending toward a bomb. And that pressure was continued in the Carter administration. Now, you and other subjects have very much come down in favor of linkage, of linking an overall package with what we do around the world. Now, the linkage of U.S. nuclear cooperation, including exports, to adoption by other countries of non-proliferation controls over their nuclear activities was mandated in the 78 NNPA, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act. Now, your statement the other day suggests you don't agree with that, and the statement of yours I read just a moment ago, that you don't agree with that policy. And let me state this. What we tried to do with the NNPA was we made a very conscious decision. Are we going to have business just go all around the world, and are we going to have business be as involved as possible and hope to control nuclear matters that way? Or are we going to make it a government-to-government operation? We debated this for about 2 years here before we finally passed that thing, and the decision was it should be government-to-government. We stood before the world saying that if safeguards went in, if NPT was there, as we have obtained the agreement of 108 nations around this world, then we would then cooperate with these nations in the benefits of nuclear matters, benefiting electrical generation and medical experiments and so on. But what we tried to prevent was the flow of plutonium unrestricted around the world. We tried to prevent reprocessing going around the world and uranium enrichment going around the world that are key toward building bombs in ever and ever smaller and smaller nations. Now, I gathered from your statements the other day you do not agree with that approach. And I would like to know what your approach is toward controlling non-proliferation, since you apparently, from your statement the other day, do not agree with the tack that we have taken.
Well, I would hope, Senator, you didn't draw the conclusion I did not agree. I think you'll find that the launching of the non-proliferation talks occurred during a period when I was a contributor to that policy. I think I've reiterated several times before this committee that I am stringently opposed to the proliferation of nuclear weaponry throughout the world. I think the point I tried to make, I did in my opening statement, was that it's very easy to wrap yourselves around these very important and desirable objectives, but that if the policies you pursue, in a linkage sense, generate an appetite for these weapons, then you may have been indulging in a very counterproductive set of ancillary policies with respect to the basic objective you're talking about. And I probably would have voted with you had I been sitting in your chair on the India issue, for precisely that reason. The point I tried to make early in the article you cited, and I'm delighted you read it because I didn't know anybody had, was that early on in this administration, after two governments, with the acquiescence of the preceding administration, had launched into talks for commercial employment of commercial nuclear power capabilities with some transfer in technology, we're suddenly confronted with a straight up and down stone wall with a threat to terminate the shipment of enriched uranium to two of our major allies who were highly dependent on the development of peaceful nuclear energy in their societies.
Well, how do we control things if we don't link it to something like that?
Well,
We have no handle on it unless we do link.
Everything is nuanced. Everything is a lot of very fine judgments with a number of contradictions being counterbalanced against others. And I hope that you don't misread my concerns about that as listed in that magazine piece to suggest I'm in favor of nuclear proliferation. Hardly at all. Nothing can be more dangerous to all of us. But I would again underline that nations seek such weaponry in the context of their own subjective assessment of their security needs. And when we preside over a world and contribute to a world where terrorism, wars of liberation, regional disputes go unchallenged by the United States, we have frequently created a climate and an atmosphere which is going to make your good motives and mine on non-proliferation almost irrelevant.
Would you favor a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Mideast, knowing that at least it's common rumor knowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal? That's been alleged anyway. Would you advocate a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Mideast and try and keep everything out of that area?
Well, I'd like to look at it in the context of the reality. It doesn't serve a useful purpose for the United States to be on a soapbox on an issue for which we're going to lose profoundly because of perhaps the very reason you mentioned.
There's been a speculation that the new Reagan administration might create a position of Assistant Secretary of State for Nuclear Export Matters. Are you considering that?
Well, I haven't had an opportunity, unfortunately, to look at very much departmental business, as urgent as it is. I'm sorry.
Okay. The obvious follow-on to that is that we have an independent check on nuclear export licensing matters now run through the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I think they were a good safety check for us there with regard to this fuel shipment to Terrapore. Now, it didn't work out the way they voted, nor the way I hoped it would here, but it was I think we ought to think very carefully before we undo that safety net that we have established there. I might point out also, we have a GAO report that I doubt if you've had the opportunity to read, but it's been recently completed, that we have not identified a single reactor order that was lost as a result of our non-proliferation policy with NNPA. I may want to come back with some other questions on this a little bit later in what little time I have left. Let me get back on another subject here, and that's the relationship between China and Taiwan. The People's Republic of China have rejected the Taiwan Relations Act as the basis for U.S. relations with Taiwan, and instead point to the joint communique signed at the time the U.S. and China normalized relations. Extremely important what's going on in that part of the world is, do you believe the Taiwan Relations Act, the Shanghai Communique, and the joint communique signed at the time the U.S. and China normalized relations to be compatible, workable? I guess two questions. One, do you think they're compatible? And number two, do you recommend any changes in that whole order of things with regard to China and Taiwan?
In general, I think they are compatible, Senator. That's a great, that will ultimately be translated in terms of style and rhetoric and ancillary and outflowing policies. I think this is an extremely sensitive subject that doesn't lend itself to further elaboration in a public forum.
I would tend to agree with you, and I'm glad, almost glad it's our job to ask the question. It's your job to refuse them. I'm almost glad you moved it into executive session, which I don't know that we've set a time for it yet, but we want to do that.
5 p.m.
5 o'clock. Okay, good. On the extent of our security ties to the PRC, and with regard to the transfers of dual-use technology and non-lethal military equipment, what do you believe to be the existing nature and scope of our relationship with China first, and how should we implement that with what equipment?
Well, this clearly also falls into the category of the preceding question.
All right.
I think our basic relationship, as I mentioned on Saturday, with the People's Republic of China is strategic, to say nothing of the long-standing historic relationships of friendship with the people of China.
Yeah. One reason I'm concerned about a little bit, in the U.S. News and World Report, in an interview at the time of your departure as SACEUR, you stated, if quoted correctly, and I trust you were, that an increasingly pragmatic China, constrained by assessments of strategic reality rather than pure dogma, is going to be capable of accepting just so many disappointments from the West, end of quote. And then more recently in the Washington Quarterly you wrote, quote, the advantages of the Chinese relationship will continue only if the Chinese leaders are convinced that ties with the West ameliorate their existing weaknesses vis-a-vis the Russians. I guess my question is, what kind of time constraints do you see on this? I tend to agree with you. There has to be something in it for everybody, us, them, or the relationship tends to deteriorate. Extremely important relationship that we nurture along somehow. This is 1/4 of the human race who we've opened up contact with, in which you played a vital role in that process. I don't know whether you want to save that for executive session or not, but do you wish to comment on it? What kind of time constraints are we operating on?
So
well, you did, but what I'm interested in is a timetable, if there is such a thing, because there's been a great deal of misunderstanding. The President-elect first said he wanted official relations with Taiwan. I don't think when he made that statement he knew what official relations meant in that context. That was a buzzword that really set the diplomatic cables humming. And then he modified his position a little bit later to indicate his policy toward Taiwan would be based on the Taiwan Relations Act. At the same time, the PRC does not recognize the Taiwan Relations Act, so he got himself in deeper, and you're going to have to dig him out. How are we going to do that?
Well, Senator, I have great confidence that we're going to be able to further the improvement of our relationships with the People's Republic of China. It's been a long-standing and well-known objective of mine, evidence the two quotes you cited here. And I don't mean to suggest in the context of the People's Republic being able to accept just so many disappointments that they are going to go on a convergent path suddenly with the Soviet Union, perhaps. But I think their basic contribution to international stability and with some convergence in policy areas would be in jeopardy as the first manifestation, and I think that would be a net loss for all of us and for international stability at large. I don't think it serves any useful purpose to parse out here a number of the nuances that your question deserves, simply because it can put in jeopardy the objectives that you and I apparently share on this issue.
Yeah. I'm sure we do share them, and I would like to get into that some in executive session. I think an economic, well, maybe I'll save that one too. No, I won't ask it now. Do you believe that the commercial economic relationship between the U.S. and China should be allowed to proceed as it has, or should it be accelerated, slowed down?
Well, there are a number of constraints on those policies over which we as Americans have very little control. I've suggested to American business leaders on occasion that it isn't just a question of opening up the door to the People's Republic and suddenly finding a vast and extensive new market for finished American products. In the first place, I don't think our Chinese friends, the People's Republic, would permit themselves to become overly dependent on any one regional or national entity.
They've gone a very independent course. That is
Yes,
true in the past, and I agree with that. Let me ask one other thing here. Maybe you could be thinking about this, and I'll get back into it when my turn comes around again. In your opening statement, you talked about some items of permanent bedrock of foreign policy. And you indicated some very fundamental world problems. You listed some of those: diffusion of power, socioeconomic challenges we all face, third world problems, Soviet imperialism, some other goals that are continuing U.S. goals: hunger, poverty, free flow of goods and ideas, some qualities of foreign policy. Do you see any other, I want to get into this later because my time is up and the red light is on, but are there other big tides flowing that are sort of worldwide items that you could list for us that you see as being very formative of foreign policy? Now, I have some of my own ideas, so I won't put those out right now, but I would welcome this because this is going to form much of what you're able to do in formulating foreign policy and working with other nations around the world. There are some big tides running in this world that are changing international relations and foreign diplomacy to a drastic degree, and they've come up just in the last few years. And I would welcome any additional addenda remarks along that line to your opening statement that you might wish to make. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Glenn. Senator Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Haig, I followed the exchange you had with Senator Helms earlier with a considerable degree of interest, and it actually brought back to my memory an article that appeared in early December reporting that you and Senator Helms had met in his office and that you had assured him that if nominated for Secretary of State, you would not pursue the policies of your former mentor, Henry Kissinger, and that you also promised to clean out the State Department to place conservatives in key policy positions. First, is this an accurate story?
I would say that it is characteristic of many of the press reports that we read from day to day and hour to hour, and would not be completely representative of that discussion.
Let me then ask you this question. What private assurances have been given by you to senators with respect to your prospective performance in office?
Senator, I would suggest that there are few who've come before this committee for the office that I am nominated for, whose public record is as complete as is mine on the host of areas about which you are interested and concerned. And I have made no commitments to any senators on any topic. But I think there are a number of senators who have read both my speeches and my articles over a number of years, who have reason to be comfortable that our views either converge, just as some might be concerned that they might diverge.
Well, I have no problem with that, and I'm not really trying to lead you down some path. All I want to be certain of is that your undertakings are either expressed before this committee in the course of this hearing, because obviously senators ask you questions and they do in fact get undertakings from you, or on the public record. And my question is whether there are any undertakings that you have made in the course of discussion with members of the Senate about your nomination that are not publicly known and that ought to be placed on the, at least in my view, ought to be placed on the public record.
Well, I think there were two issues that you referred to, and I think I have in my opening statement and in my formal comments, and I suspect in the few actions I've been able to take with respect to the Department of State, can offer no more than that with respect to my high regard for our professional diplomatic corps, our Foreign Service officer asset, and with respect to any other aspect of my policy reviews, I think we are getting a very frank, open, and balanced expression of it. And I would have to suggest that you make your judgments on your assessment of my responses here.
How do you expect that personnel decisions will be made at the Department of State if you are the Secretary?
Personnel selections?
Personnel decisions. How will those decisions be made if you are the Secretary of State?
Well, it depends, of course, on the level to which we are referring. But the key levels of undersecretary and above, assistant secretary, undersecretary, deputy, agency chiefs, I would expect to make a recommendation to the President-elect based on my best assessment of the best man for that job within the constraints of public service, and I run into that from time to time, unfortunately. And I would anticipate that President Reagan would approve my recommendations. Where he did not, I would anticipate that we would have further discussion. I've had enough experience with the President-elect to know that first he listens, he welcomes dissent, should there be some, and I would feel constrained to register that dissent if I were uncomfortable with the individual selection that might be suggested to me.
I take it then that you feel that it's important to the successful conduct and leadership of the department that you, in effect, if you're the Secretary, be able to essentially make the personnel decisions for the department.
As a general rule, yes.
Is it your intention to recuse yourself from decisions that might come to you as Secretary that would involve United Technology?
Absolutely.
And also the Chase Manhattan Bank, of which you were, as I understand it, an outside director. Is that correct?
Absolutely, but I want to broaden that response to make it clear that I will disassociate myself totally from both United Technologies and my current limited duties as a member of the board of Chase Manhattan Bank.
I understand that, and that's in your, that's in the statement from the Office of Government Ethics. I was taking the question a step further, and that was decisions which, for instance, on export licenses that involve the State Department, whether and your former companies, whether you would make those decisions or recuse yourself from making those decisions.
I can assure you I'll abide completely and thoroughly by the provisions of existing laws and regulations in that regard. Absolutely.
Well, even if it does not require it as a legal matter, would you think it well advised that in those instances you allow that decision to be made by the Undersecretary, for example?
Well, that would be especially true with United Technologies because of my intimate involvement in the management of that corporation. And I can't foresee where it would not also be true with Chase National Bank, but there's a parsing out aspect to the financial matters of some of our complex banking organizations, and I just don't want to give you a blind response here that you would later be able to say, well, I had given you assurances over and above good sound practice provided for in regulation and law.
Well, I think that's a satisfactory answer. General, will you maintain existing State Department policy for responding to congressional requests for information? There is an established policy now that I think is very forthcoming and that is sensitive to the needs of members of the Congress for information, and it's in place, and I want to know whether you will maintain that existing policy.
Well, I'm sorry, I am not familiar with the precise aspect of that policy in which you speak. You mean to respond within a certain number of hours to a request, or in general?
No, it's a policy statement that Secretary Vance issued a few years ago, and that is, in effect, a directive to all department personnel on responding to congressional requests for information, and outlines a procedure to be followed, and I think has been viewed by most as being highly responsive to congressional desires for information, and has to all accounts worked well, and that's obviously a matter of great concern, I would think, to certainly to all members of this committee and probably to all or most members of the Congress.
Senator, I'd like to look at it, and if I would find some reason for being uncomfortable with one or more of its provisions, I would commit myself to discussing that with the committee here to be sure that you would understand why. The reason I answer the way I do is I just haven't read it, and it puts me at somewhat of a disadvantage. I would hope, have some suggestions for even enhancing and improving and expediting that consultation and information responsiveness.
Well, I don't want to add...
You are ready then to respond to that. I will recognize you for that purpose. We will insert it in the record with any comments you wish to make.
That was the point I was about to make. I don't want to add to General Haig's work burden, but I do think that in this instance it would be helpful for him to review this policy and let us know his view of it before these hearings conclude. Would you place any impediment or restrictions upon the access of this committee to the views of officials of the department and of our ambassadors? In other words, on our ability to have them come before the committee in either open or closed session, and for the committee members to have the benefit of their views on policy issues.
No, as a general rule, not at all. That gets close to the sensitive subject of executive privilege, and I think I know that I don't have either the authority or the prerogative to exercise that. That's the decision of the President. I have in the past been required to adhere by such a decision. And so I would not want to suggest that should he make such a decision, I'm going to circumvent it by some arrangement here. I think also the caveat of understanding that there are certain discussions between any executive and his subordinates which are informal and not any more than preliminary to decision making, which must be kept in the confines of those conducting that discussion. If we were to do otherwise, we would find ourselves soon posturing each other for public disclosure in sensitive issues which one seeks recommendations and honest, objective, to the best of one's ability. And with that caveat, of course.
In recent years, the State Department has notified on a confidential basis this committee in advance of all significant international agreements authorized for negotiation, including an indication of whether they will be conducted as treaties or as executive agreements. That has been an advance notice, confidential, and so kept by the committee of significant international agreements authorized for negotiation. Can we anticipate that this practice would continue during your term of office?
Absolutely.
What is your view on the types of important agreements, if any, which can be concluded as executive agreements rather than treaties?
Well, as you know, Senator, this is a very, very fuzzy area, both in practice and in written clarity. It has been over the years and over the history of our country. I think, if anything, the trending has been in the direction of erring on the side of treaty. I think I understand the reason for that. And I feel, as a purely pragmatic step, as a member of the executive branch seeking both legislative, essential legislative, and essential popular support, that I would be inclined to lean in that direction as you parse out what really lends itself to executive agreement or formal treaty. I don't know that that's as responsive to your question as you wanted it to be, but I would say in general...
Well, of course, there's been congressional concern expressed in the past that a number of arrangements are entered into as executive agreements, precluding the type of congressional review which, of course, a treaty would receive. And I think we need to know how you generally view that problem without asserting that everything need be a treaty. But
well, I think you would be as burdened as would we in the executive branch where we'd accept that as a thesis. On the other hand, I think our a priori obligations that you touched upon earlier are going to be invaluable in sorting out what is the best approach to take on a particular issue.
Would you expect to shift where the division has been in the last few years on the question of executive agreement and treaty?
No. In fact, perhaps I would move even further to the treaty route for the reasons I just cited.
And one final question along this line. Do you have any problems or reservations with strict compliance with the CASE Act, which provides for transmitting to the Congress the text of any international agreement entered into by the United States?
No, I have no, and I would intend to abide by our existing obligations there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time.
Thank you, Senator Sarbanes. Senator Mathias is next in order. I understand that he wishes to yield to Senator Boschwitz, who desires to ask questions before the recess. Is that correct?
I just would like to, I think, since there is obviously not time to finish a round, I would prefer to start off at 2 o'clock so that I can have an uninterrupted round of questions. I believe Senator Boschwitz just wants to make some brief remark at this
If you
point.
wish to make just a comment, then we will adhere to our 1 p.m. recess period.
I want to make a brief comment, Mr. Chairman, about Senator Glenn's comment to Senator Lugar in response to Senator Lugar's comment, and perhaps I'll wait for just a second while Senator Glenn, I wanted to just answer your comments on Senator Lugar's comments. I believe that he certainly was not, and I spoke to him after your comments briefly. Senator Lugar wasn't trying to cast any aspersions, establish any blame on anybody present with respect to the difficulties he foresees. He, as I and all of us, are very anxious to get as much evidence as we can before us, but I think he was reflecting on what he perceives the archivist is going to say this afternoon, and that is that we're probably not going to get a look at the index or the log of the tapes, and that then there's going to be a delay, and then there will be some further delays, and that unfortunately we may send the Secretary of State out with a cloud of some sort hanging over him. And as you said in your earliest remarks during these hearings, that the Secretary is not going to have any options of a 60 to 90-day learning period. He has to hit the ground running. And to hit the ground running with a cloud existing is not particularly desirable, and that this committee will have to deal with that matter, and that will be, I think, an important aspect of part of the confirmation hearing. Because as you pointed out, those kind of lawsuits, you use the figure of 6 months. Probably